Molt bona tarda, molt benvingudes i benvinguts al Palau Macaya de la Fundació La Caixa, Centre UNESCO per les Ciències Socials i les Humanitats. Comencem puntuals, ho sento, però el director d'aquest espai soc una mica radical amb això, i si més no per respecte als que heu vingut d'hora. Com us deia, li deia aquest dematí que parlàvem amb Ferriol, estem a la tardor i pels que treballem en el Palau Macaya, la tardor o l'inici de curs significa algunes coses i una d'elles és que vol dir que ens arriba el cicle que organitzem amb la Fundació Ernest Lluch. I per tant, molt contents d'un any més i crec que des del 2011, per tant són una pila d'anys, primer el Caixa Fòrum Barcelona i des de fa uns quants anys ja ho fem aquí en el Palau Macaya, fem aquest cicle, que enguany hem titulat Una pau precària. En un curs on justament la Fundació Ernest Lluch commemora els 25 anys de l'assassinat de l'Ernest Lluch. I abans de continuar faig una salutació especial a alguns membres del patronat de la Fundació Ernest Lluch, l'Enric i algunes altres persones que, disculpeu, no els conec a tots. Evidentment el director de la Fundació, el senyor Ferriol Sòria, i des d'aquí també una abraçada, com que gravem aquest acte, i suposo que se'l mirarà en el seu president, el senyor Joan Major. I també els dos convidats que ens acompanyen avui, el senyor Kristian Herbolzheimer, que és el director de l'Institut Català Internacional per la Pau, i la senyora Sanam Naraghi-Alguini, espero que hagi dit bé els seus cognoms, fundadora i seu de la International Civil Society Action Network for Women's Rights i algunes altres coses més. Com molts de vosaltres sabeu, aquí al Palau Macaya som un espai de diàleg i reflexió sobre els diferents reptes que tenim al davant de la nostra societat. I avui, més que mai, celebrem la força del pensament, de la paraula i sobretot del diàleg en un món que canvia a molta velocitat i en un món que el tenim ple de reptes. Fa unes setmanes, en un altre acte que fèiem en una tarda com la d'avui, recordo que fèiem una petita reflexió i dèiem que vivim en un món que és molt complex, molt ple d'incertesa i dèiem també d'avaluació dels valors humans més elementals. I lligat amb això, a mi em venia, quan aquest matí em preparava 4 notes, per lo que estic fent ara, quan als inicis de l'hivern passat, tot just acabant el cicle de l'any passat, vam iniciar les primeres reunions amb en Ferriol per pensar sobre quina temàtica faríem el cicle que avui estem inaugurant, i reflexionant sobre l'actual conjuntura, que llavors també ja estava així, de deriva del món actual en el que vivim, recordo que mentre anàvem analitzant coses i anàvem debatent, al final una mica ens apareixien com dos conceptes que hem tingut la sort que el Ferriol i el seu equip li han donat forma, que un era justament la cultura de la pau i l'altre era intentar oferir un missatge propositiu que ens aportés també una mica d'esperança. És a dir, que també hi ha reflexions, hi ha idees, hi ha exemples, que pensem que és possible, és un altre món, i que hi ha altres valors relacionats amb els drets humans que val la pena recordar i practicar, afegiria aquest verb. Per tant, inaugurem aquest cicle amb un programa que durant 4 sessions de diàlegs, i en aquest context de pau precària, com heu vist en suposo a la web i en el programa que han editat, reflexionarem sobre el present de la cultura de la pau, que és el diàleg que tenim avui, la noció de llibertat dèbil i forces de control mentre convivim amb la fascinació pel mal, les derivades de la nova geopolítica i sobretot la pregunta sobre com es pot gestionar aquesta guerra comercial per mantenir una economia i pau estables. Tots vosaltres us convido a viure aquest cicle amb curiositat i sobretot amb esperit crític, que és el que intentem aportar aquí des del Palau Macaya, i que cada una de les sessions, cada un dels diàlegs que des de la Fundació Ernest Lluch ens proposen sigui una oportunitat per aprendre, per qüestionar i per construir plegats una societat més oberta i més conscient. Vull acabar donant les gràcies a totes les persones que han fet possible aquest cicle, a l'equip del Ferriol, a la programadora d'activitats que tinc aquí al Palau Macaya, que és la Mònica Badia, que avui no ens pot acompanyar, per haver fet possible la producció d'aquesta proposta i a tots vosaltres per venir i per fer-nos confiança. El fet que estigueu aquí és el que dona sentit que organitzem activitats com la d'avui. Moltes gràcies i dono la paraula al senyor Ferriol Sòria.
Molt bé, doncs, moltes gràcies, Pep, el director del Palau Macaya. Molt breument, són 15 sessions ja de 15 cicles que hem fet amb la Fundació La Caixa, 10 hi ha aquí al Palau Macaya, per tant un agraïment no només al director sinó a tot l'equip tècnic que permet que estiguem aquí, que avui puguem compartir aquest primer diàleg. Dir-vos, com ha avançat el Pep, que per nosaltres aquest any no és un any qualsevol, són 25 anys, farà 25 anys ara aquest 21 de novembre de l'assassinat de l'Ernest Lluch, i és en aquests moments una figura que ja és una figura per tothom. La Fundació, com saben, va néixer per tenir cura del seu llegat, projectar a futur les seves inquietuds i fomentar el diàleg entre els ciutadans per reflexionar i millorar la qualitat de la democràcia en la mesura del possible, la cohesió social, estan especialment atents també a la sostenibilitat tant social com financera del sistema públic de salut. I hem volgut fer-ho sent fidel als valors que encarnava el Lluch, però també entenent que són els valors que com a societat projectem perquè entenem que són desitjables. I el principal és el del diàleg, el diàleg com a instrument intel·ligent per resoldre conflictes, discrepàncies. El diàleg és l'essència de la democràcia pura, la pulsió no bel·ligerant de la humanitat. A vegades figures com les de l'Ernest Lluch creixen i es consoliden i ens ajuden a vertebrar imaginaris sobre el que podem construir ciutadania compartida. I avui recordem plegats, per descomptat, la figura humanista de l'Ernest Lluch, però també la importància de posar en valor els nostres comuns denominadors. Per tant, fer de Lluch un espai de trobada. Si parlem de diàleg i d'un espai, doncs avui ens trobem aquí i no és estrany que fem un cicle que parli de pau, una pau precària. El Pep ha avançat les diferents sessions i per tant no em repetiré, i ho farem amb dues persones que ens fa molta il·lusió que ens acompanyin i a qui vull agrair d'entrada que ens acompanyin avui, la Sanam, Naraghi-Anderlini i el Kristian Herbolzheimer. La Sanam, com ha dit el director del Palau Macaya, és directora general i fundadora de la International Civil Society Action Network i fins fa ben poc professora associada a la Universitat de Colúmbia. L'ICANN, que lidera la Sanam, agrupa més de 90 organitzacions de construcció de pau liderades per dones a 40 països diferents per prevenir la violència, promoure la pau, els drets i el pluralisme. La Sanam és una defensora coneguda internacionalment en el camp de les dones, la pau i la seguretat. De fet, va ser directora del Centre for Women and Security del desembre del 2019 fins al 22 a la London School of Economics i ha treballat en combinació amb la societat civil, governs i nacions. No m'extendré, ha treballat molt amb la ONU, ha dirigit iniciatives pioneres i l'any 2000 va ser una de les líders de la societat civil que va redactar la resolució 1325 del Consell de Seguretat de la ONU sobre dones, pau i seguretat. És una de les persones que estan inclosa en l'equip de mediació de la ONU, en reserva per quan hi ha situacions en què s'hagi d'intervenir, i ha estat consultora en diferents ocasions. No m'extendré, és membre de múltiples consells d'assessorament, etc., múltiples premis, múltiples participacions a mitjans de comunicació des de la BBC, la CNN, etc. És un plaer que ens pugui acompanyar avui. És, a més, membre de l'Ordre de l'Imperi Britànic, una de les coses d'aquestes que també formen part del currículum. Per nosaltres és un honor i una alegria que ens pugui acompanyar avui. Moltes gràcies, Sanam, per acompanyar-nos. Thank you very much. I amb ella tenim el Kristian Herbolzheimer, diguem-ho bé, que és director de l'Institut Català Internacional per la Pau des del setembre del 2008, i el Kristian, que ve més amb formació de tècnica agrícola i per tant va acabar, però que va entrar en l'àmbit social a partir de la vessant ecològica. Amb un viatge a Colòmbia va acabar entrant al món de la pau i a través d'una persona molt estimada com el Vicenç Fises, una gran persona que hem de recordar més, em sembla. Va convertir-se en un analista de processos de pau, expert en el paper de la societat civil en les transicions i ha treballat tant a les Filipines com en el conflicte del País Basc, Colòmbia, i amb anterioritat a l'ICIP, de ser director de l'ICIP, va estar en el programa de transicions a una institució que es diu Conciliation Resources durant 10 anys i va estar treballant a l'Escola de Cultura de Pau, també de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Kristian, moltes gràcies per acompanyar-nos. Com sabeu, això és un diàleg, vol dir que ells s'automoderaran i vol dir que tindran una estona per ells i al final tindrem un espai per preguntes que us demanem que pugueu fer per escrit. Llavors les recollirem i així podrem formular-ne el màxim possible per aprofitar que els tenim aquí. Per tant, sense més, això és un diàleg, els donem la paraula i moltes gràcies, que vagi molt bé.
Moltes gràcies, Ferriol, per aquesta invitació. I a tots vosaltres per ser aquí avui, aquest vespre. La conversa la tindrem en anglès i, per tant, entenc que qui ho necessités ja hi havia els aparells de traducció a l'entrada. Sanam, such a pleasure to have this dialogue with you this evening.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry I'm not speaking Spanish or Catalan, so next time I will try my best. Thank you very much.
Well, wonderful. I thought to frame our conversation, we could look into the current context and maybe a little bit taking a few steps back. Back in 1992, the then UN Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali, announced an agenda for peace. And that was a time of the transition in South Africa. That was, and the subsequent years saw a number of peace agreements in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, in Mozambique, in Northern Ireland, all over the world. The decades of the 90s and the early 21st century, according to the Uppsala Peace and Conflict Database, saw a reduction in the number of armed conflicts by half. And with that, a reduction in the number of casualties of the armed conflict, with, of course, some episodes, dramatic episodes, the war in the Balkans, the genocide in Rwanda, and whatnot. But I think both you and me in that time, as peace builders, we were saying, well, that's cool, that's good, it's not good enough. Could be much better, right? So we are starting to work, what else can be done so that our peace processes are really more sustainable and transformative. But while we were in that activism, the trend changed. And for the last maybe 15 years, more or less around September 11, what we have been seeing is a new increase of the number of armed conflict, to the point that today, again, according to the Uppsala conflict database, the number of armed conflicts is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War. The number of people dying is unprecedented since the end of the World War. The number of refugees in the world, more than 100 million according to UNHCR, is unprecedented. And at the same time, the military expenditure, again, is unprecedented. So what is supposed to give us security, spending more on weapons, is at the same time is happening when insecurity is increasing. That's talking about armed conflicts. We have the global crisis, whether it's health, whether it's climate change, whether it is whatnot. So the current picture is not very encouraging. What's your take on where we are right now?
I go between different states of mind, because when I hear the nature of the problems, it's exhausting. I mean, that's it, and it's depressing. Because 25 years ago, or in the 90s, when you and I started in this field, we called it the peace dividend. We believed in our institutions. We believed that we had it was the ascendance of the West. You know, the Soviet Union had been basically crumbled, and we thought democracy, rule of law, there was going to be an ascendance of these values, and we believed in our institutions. Fast forward to where we are now, that age, first of all, 9/11 changed it radically, and I think we should have stopped in our field of practice and understood the inflection point, and we can talk about that. But I think since 9/11, the Iraq War, which the Americans don't really want to admit, that was their first time of taking a baseball bat and, sort of destroying the foundations of the UN system. And then following on with that, the various conflicts that we've had, of course, Ukraine and now Gaza, really challenges who is holding up the rule of law? Who do we go to? Who do we trust? So we're looking for that. We're looking for somebody to for some government and to uphold that. And it's overwhelming. So that's one thing that I would say. And so there are moments where I think it's time to retire and go and plant trees and do something different with life. On the other hand, we can't give up. This is a moment of inflection for all of us because it's this climactic, it's like a geopolitical tsunami. That's how I think about it. A geopolitical tsunami. It's like this massive wave is coming. It is a combination of this militarism. $2.3 trillion is going towards weaponization in our societies, right? And sometimes I wonder who is driving that. Because if you look at the major arms companies, it's mainly American, but also European, but mainly American, in the last 2 years, they've increased their lobbying at the European Union in Brussels by 40%. And that's just that's the stuff that we can see. In England, there's a company called BAE. They have had 1.6 average every day, at least 1.6 high-level political meetings for the last 10 years. So who is driving this push for militarism, and to what end? And therefore, the rest of us need to stand up and speak out and inform ourselves and not cede that debate. So I feel, on that one hand, very overwhelmed. On the other hand, enraged and kind of energized by it, and feel that it's our duty to our children, actually.
And I thought we could, based on that, maybe also take a few steps back and remind ourselves and maybe also share, this courage, this motivation, even in the darkest or very dark times we are now. What got us into this?
Yes. What did get you in?
Exactly. Yeah. So when did Sanam start with doing peace and why? And that legacy, how have you carried it forward to today?
But I want to hear your story as well. So my story is it meanders. So I'm Iranian by background. I was 11 years old when the Iranian Revolution happened, and it was as if somebody took a fan and just scattered my whole family all over the world. And for many of you, the Iranian Revolution is history. For me, every day, every decade of my life, it brings a new reality. So when I was in my 20s and I was getting married, it was visas for my relatives to come to England. We couldn't get visas. Fast forward 10 years ago, my father was very ill and he was in Iran, and I had to weigh whether I would go to visit him in hospital against whether I would get arrested if I went, and if I would get other people into trouble. And it's been 10 years I haven't been able to visit his gravesite. So it's deeply, deeply personal in terms of how the politics becomes entwined in our lives. Now, in the 1990s, I became interested in the idea of, can you go from dictatorship to democracy without violence? Is there conflict transformation or non-violent conflict transformation that's possible? And I was really inspired by the South African experience. And so to me, it was, if South Africa can do this, other countries should be able to do this. That was one side of the debate. The other side was that I was interested in journalism at the time, and I was working in the newsroom at CNN. And on the screen, I think it was in April of '94, there was the inauguration of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, so this incredible hope. and at the same time there was the genocide in Rwanda. And the camera, I don't know whose camera it was, zooming in on people killing each other on the streets across Rwanda. And I remember thinking, how can you have a camera observing that and not intervene to stop it? And so I think the combination of these two factors, the hope of South Africa and this insanity that we observe but we don't act, propelled me into this universe of saying, can I do something about it differently? Yeah, that was how I got into this. How about you?
I agree. I fully agree with you that personal experience shapes a lot of what we end up doing, and then, of course, what happens in our lives and what we observe in our lives. We didn't live in an armed conflict, or we had our own dictatorship, but I was too young to suffer those consequences. So the first impact in my life of a violent act was a bombing by ETA, the Basque terrorist organization, which in June 1987 planted a bomb at a supermarket here in Barcelona. I was 17 years old at that time. I was in school, and then the news came out, and all of a sudden the message was, everybody go down to downtown Barcelona to demonstrate spontaneously. Let's get out to the street to protest the violence by ETA. And that was my first indirect, very distant experience of violence, and that made me think of, violence, peace. I was a member of Greenpeace at that time, and Greenpeace, it was more the green, the environmental, not so much the peace side, but I liked that link of both things, and I think it's a very, still today, a very powerful name. And then after that, different circumstances in life have shaped my experience and my approach. I remember another one. I was volunteering in Nicaragua back in the early 90s. The revolution had happened in 1979. This is the second armed revolution in Latin America that is successful in terms of achieving power. The first one was a Cuban. Then came the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then nothing else. All other Latin American countries have had armed groups trying to seize power. None of them have achieved it. But my experience was in the transition from the Sandinista regime to the first democratic elections and to what followed. And what I experienced in Nicaragua was the revolution created a counter-revolution. Mm-hmm. And no matter how unfair and supported by the CIA and related to drug dealing and how many ugly things, the thing is, violence led to more violence. And there was a cycle. And for me, that was a realization that, okay, you may have revolutionary dreams, you may want to transform your society, but as you said, non-violently in Iran, I thought, well, the armed revolution in Nicaragua didn't bring the change it was supposed to bring, so it's not through armed revolution. And then I started working more in the field of peace building, first in the academic side here at the Autonomous University, then at an NGO, and now more lately with a public peace institute. But there's one more incident which I think has marked most of us in this room, and which was referred to by Ferriol in the opening marks, which was the killing of Ernest Lluch, and his relatives are here and very glad and pleased to see them. But that had also a very huge impact. I was already then in the peace world, but I was starting in the peace world. But again, ETA, 13 years after my first experience, ETA was still there, was still bombing, was still killing. And in this case, it killed somebody who was advocating for dialogue. This was a very polarized time politically. Hardliners in the armed group, but hardliners in the central government were shaping the politics, going nowhere. Things were just getting worse. Here you had somebody doing something, risking his life for doing something, and gets killed for what he did. Mm-hmm. And that had a very strong impact. And the reaction of family and the reaction of the public demonstrating in the streets, protesting that act of violence, but at the same time holding up the message of dialogue, that made me think something maybe I wanted to bring in later, but why not do it now? Yeah. Because you have faced so many unfair situations in the world that dialogue seems even something naive in terms of the brutality some actors have. But it's still a fundamental tool in building peace, isn't it?
I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, to just give some context as well, I went back to Iran in 1986, and it was still the Iran-Iraq war was being fought. And my father took me to the cemetery where the fighters, the soldiers would get buried. And when I say soldiers, many of them were young boys. And so what became very real to me was that politicians make decisions to go to war, to invade, for whatever, for political reasons, and it's other people's children that they send out. And the burial sites were so moving, because in Islam you're not meant to have images. It's all script. You're not meant to sort of have an image. But people didn't care. I mean, under the auspices of this Islamic Republic that was very, very heavy-handed at the time, you went to the burial site where the Iran-Iraq of the young boys, and it was people had put little boxes, and it was the picture, and it was the toys, and it was very, very personal. So, it brings the horror of war home in a very different way, and you just think, why? Why are these kids being killed? To whose benefit? Is it this question for me always it resonates, that what is the point of violence? Who is benefiting from violence? And violence itself is a form of dialogue. It's a form of communication. Right?
That's counterintuitive.
Because it's what is dialogue? Dialogue is a form of communication. It just happens to be that you and I sit and use words. We could use pictures. We could use, and to some it's using bombs. Now it's using Twitter. But to sit opposite each other, or actually, as my Israeli and Palestinian colleagues 20 years ago said, imagine sitting on the same side of the table and looking at the future together. So you're not even adversarial. You're saying, we are here today. Where are we going? That future hasn't been created for us and for our children. So dialogue is incredibly radical in the context of politics, which has become so polarized and so, in some ways, highly sort of machismo, I think, because it's like, we have to all be tough and strong, and strength means not talking. Whereas in my universe, where I work with women understand that we don't have the physical strength. Like it's stupid for us to come forward and try and use violence or physicality to address conflict. We use our words. We use our imagination. We tap into another way of trying to engage. And I've always found it interesting if you look through history and storytelling. I'm a literature major before I did anthropology. If you think about the 1001 Nights, Scheherazade, and there's a despotic king who every night rapes and kills a woman, a girl. And Scheherazade comes along, and through her words, she convinces him not to kill her. And then one night. And then the next night she tells another story. And the next night she tells another story. And for 1001 nights she's telling stories. And what it does is that not only it saves her and, in principle, the other women that could have come after her if she'd been killed, but through her words she changes the behavior of the king. She makes him a much more compassionate and better leader as well. So to me, the essence of, as I say, dialogue as a tool of communication is, it's something that human beings have more than other species in this world, although now we hear that, even the river and the trees are talking to each other. Let's use it.
But that's a story from 1001 Nights. Does that work in reality? I mean, you have met people who you don't like very much, not at all, who've done ugly things. So how does that feel?
I think, again, you could argue that it's naive. One could argue that these people are so inhuman or so psychopathic, and I'm sure there are plenty that if we put them on a spectrum of what their mental condition is, I'm sure we could also look at that in terms of who becomes a leader. But what I found is actually if you're authentic in your call for peace and you're seeking the humanity in the other, it opens up all sorts of ways of communicating. I remember being at a meeting in Norway some years back, and there were some Taliban leaders there. Now, we sat, it was a big, sitting in the conference, the Americans were there, the Taliban guys are there, it's all sorts of diplomats, and it was all performative. The Americans are like, well, America thinks, and the Taliban is going so. And I'm sitting there, and at some point, I put my hand up, and I said, set aside the label, set aside an Islamic state or what do you want for your daughters and your sons? And I specifically said to them, your daughters and your sons. And they suddenly looked at me and they started talking about...
These are the Taliban.
The Taliban, about what they wanted for their society. It sounded pretty much like development. We want peace, we want our houses, we want our kids, actually we want our kids to be safe and so forth. And they wanted to talk to me for 2 hours afterwards. For 2 hours, they took us on a boat trip, and I was sitting with these Taliban leaders on a boat in the fjords of Norway, having a conversation about what is a moral society, what is an ethical society, what does, So
you would still not agree on girls' education necessarily?
So this is the thing, that I think the issue with dialogue is that, number one, you need to be able to continue it, because it's about trust building, and it's about challenging things. So at the time, if they said to me, when I said to them, look, in Iran we have an Islamic society, it's not very ethical or moral, frankly. We have the highest levels of prostitution, in the region, right? So, and they would look at me, I think that if we had been able to continue these conversations and to persist and challenge them on things like, Islam says that it is a duty of every Muslim to be educated. It doesn't discriminate between women and men, right? So who you are in the dialogue matters. What is your identity? Are you perceived as authentic or not? Are you authentic or not? And are you able to challenge and question the positions that people take with respect, right? So it's not wagging a finger and saying you people are terrible and you don't understand. It's more saying you say you're being Islamic. Well, Islam says this, the Quran says that. So that kind of a engagement of entering their space and coming back and forth, I think is important. It's not easy. It's not easy.
And you need some conditions. They must at least have a minimum willingness to engage in a conversation with somebody who might challenge them or might open up conversations which they may or may not feel uncomfortable about.
I definitely. I mean, you want to, if they're not interested, they don't talk to you. Obviously, that's one thing. But the other thing that we often see is that people are being prepared and trained to seem as if they want to have a conversation, right? And to seem as if they want to participate. And that's also inauthentic on their part. And again, the question of identity for me is very interesting. So I was with the UN when I was in Somalia. Somali peace dialogue, peace negotiations, the design of these processes is really absurd because every 6 months they'll say, okay, now we need to have a conversation, or we'll put in an interim government for a year, and nobody pays attention to actually what that interim government is doing or not. And then as it comes to the end, they're like, oh, no, we must scramble together. So it's not 20 years of a peace process. It's almost annually with a change from the international side. Just as in terms of why certain things fail, this is what I want to say. But I was in this process, and there was a lunch event, and I was sitting next to a Somali guy, and I was trying to make conversation with him. So I said, oh, what do you do? And he said, I'm the minister of ports or something. And I sat there thinking, and finally I said, you've got a beautiful coastline. Somalia has this amazing coastline on the Indian Ocean. And he looked at me and goes, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Iran, originally. And now I'm working for the UN. He knows that I'm a representative of the United Nations in this context. He goes, where are you from? I said, from Iran. And he goes, you bring me some rich Iranians, and I'll give you all the land you want. Okay? So in the space of 2 minutes, we've discovered how corrupt this man is, right? So do I trust anything he's going to say at any other point? No, right? But what was interesting is that how come he felt so at ease to say this to me? And my conclusion is that when you're in that space, as first of all as a woman, they feel disarmed. You're not a threat. Secondly, as somebody coming from a culture there or a context that they think they can relate to, and then they see your Allah or whatever, and it's as I say, it's disarming them, and you suddenly see the reality. And so for me, that was not a dialogue strand that I wanted to pursue, because I was like, this guy is completely corrupt, and and how dare he think that I would, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'll bring you some rich Iranians. I mean, it was kind of absurd, but the contrast is interesting. Yeah,
I think. Thank you for sharing these examples. And if you were able to talk to Taliban today, or in Norway, or whenever, I think that a challenge I throw to the public as well. Would we be willing to speak to somebody we completely dislike, or maybe even hate, or if we don't want to call it hate because we don't hate anybody, but we terribly disagree? And I think if we think about it rationally, we would say, yes, of course. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Precisely because we disagree, we need to talk, right? That's rationally.
Oh, it's very emotional.
Emotionally? Hey, we faced here in this context a very highly political conflict which did not turn violent. So we are not talking about a violent conflict. It's not somebody who kills you because he dislikes you, like what happens in war. This is a political conflict. And we as a Catalan society were not very good at managing our own conflict, I would say, in a constructive way, in the sense of having the curiosity. I mean, everybody ended up positioning themselves. That's normal. That's what happens in polarization. And polarization, like conflict, is normal in life. That's what we deal with all the time. But the thing is, how do we manage that conflict and that polarization? And when it turns very emotional, like we experienced here, I think we can all agree it gets more tricky.
It's I think this is something that is important to really put in the middle of the room, right? Because the field of peace building, and you tell me whether this is something that you've also experienced, but the field of peace building is actually predicated on conflict resolution practices and rationality. That if you bring two people into the room, once they understand that they have different interests, they will find a solution, because both of us want this bottle and you want the water but I want the bottle, and eventually we'll figure out that we can split, right? In my experience, and what you're talking about, is that when we're talking about actual conflict, political, ideological, obviously the questions that you deal with here in Catalonia, these are not only emotional, I think, it's visceral. Like, we feel it in our gut. It is generations of injustice and pain, actual pain. People have died, people have been threatened. If you go back to being 17 years old and the feeling of that bomb going off, it's internalized, right? And so to pretend that we can deal with everything intellectually is the first mistake that we have to make. We have to address the emotionality and the sense of injustice that we have from the past that comes.
Which sometimes comes from the past, or sometimes is just triggered. So today, looking at, we do know, we just, sorry for the publicity, published the annual survey of ICIP this week on convivencia y seguridad, coexistence and security. And looking the current context, we said it doesn't look very good. Mm-hmm. And indeed, 70% of people we spoke to said the future for the younger generations will be worse than it was for us. So wow, that's what's ahead of us. But then you do see that young people especially are the ones who don't trust democracy anymore. Young male are quite upset with feminism. They think feminism is creating trouble. 1/3 is saying, you know what, gender violence, that's an invention, that doesn't exist. And you can worry that the youth in a democratic society, without going back to generational trauma, no, this is what they feel today. And I guess here you can see some objective, or you can trace it back to there is some level of reasons. So there's structural violence, people can't access housing, and the future doesn't look better. There's more and more inequality. But then there are things that maybe are also a response to what information do they get. If we look at the political sphere, is a permanent confrontation and a zero-sum game. Some have to win and some have to lose. In the past, politics, we don't want to idealize the past, but politics, when it works, has the confrontational side of it, let's say elections, maximum polarization, vote for me, don't vote for them, because I'm good and they are bad. But then, if the system works, after elections, you dialogue and you reach agreements, and even the worst adversary is not an enemy, it's an adversary. But this seems to be changing in many places with the rise of authoritarianism, with democracy not being able to respond to the needs and the expectations of the people, and in this case, the younger generations. People say it doesn't really work anymore, and this is then fueled on one hand with what they get in the political sphere. That's that confrontation. What they get on the digital space is again going back. There's somebody fueling that.
Somebody's benefiting from it.
Somebody's benefiting upon it. And you don't need to have a generational trauma, but you just get exposed to, because the digital space, like the political space, like the regional media space, is fueled by conflict. That's the input people get, and then you don't wonder to a certain extent. But then they play on the gut feelings, they play on emotions, and that creates a very challenging situation, because what do? We have our rationale. Oh, we should dialogue, we should understand each other, we should listen to those who think differently. Hey, yeah, that sounds very good. But the power asymmetry between those fueling that conflictual side and those of us trying to fight it, that asymmetry is huge. And yeah.
And I think it's two things. I think it's really important that we understand that pessimism is the privilege of the privileged, right? So yes, the children or the young people are feeling pessimistic, or they are looking at the future in some ways, but negatively, but they're still living in a very privileged society, right? Compared to the rest of the world, compared to many parts of the world. So, and we as the older generation, we as their parents, we came into the, I was born in the 60s, so by the time the 90s came along, we had the best of it. The world opened to us, the wall fell, the democracy was on the rise. It was the end of politics. Everybody, most of my friends, I don't know about you, but most of my friends went into making money. They went into the finance, and they're doing very well for themselves. And we were, it was very strange to do what we do. Our field was. So fast forward the next generation, democracy is declining, all these problems of authoritarianism and climate and so forth. But the future hasn't yet come into existence. The future is still there to be framed and shaped. So we can look at the future and say, the future is going to be terrible. It's going to be awful. And if it's going to be violent, well, then let's all go and buy guns and contribute to that self-fulfilling, horrific prophecy. Or we can turn around and say, the future hasn't yet happened. We are here at the present. What can we do differently? And to me, the part of what we need to do differently is we need to create conditions and situations where we enable these young people who think that gender-based violence is finished and the men who are angry with the women and so forth. We need to create conditions for them to engage not just in dialogue, but actually working together, doing things together. Because it's only when you're experientially together with the other that you begin to see the humanity. And you begin to see actually we have more in common than differences. We've had in the last 10, 15 years, I mean, I've lived in America the last 10, 15 years, 20 years actually, but we've had the far right, the discourse of the far right has taken our societies from a space of diversity that we are to highlighting differences and highlighting division. So they're dividing us. And actually the far left has done the same. You know, we now have to say what our gender identity is and what our race and our faith and this and that and the other. In the business of trying to sort of show the multiple identities, we're actually stratifying and creating more atomization. My story and my experience is that yes, there's diversity. You and I are very, you know, on the surface very different. But if we train ourselves and if we train our society to look at the similarities, whether it's our interest in peace building, whether it's because, I don't know, I play squash and you say I play squash, or I say I have twins and somebody else in the audience says I have twins. We have multiple identities that we walk around with and we acquire in life. And if you're aware of that and if you think about that as a way of connecting with other human beings, we start to see the humanity and the similarity, not the differences. But we're not doing that for our children. We're not creating environments where they come together. And I'll give you some examples from the media. When I was growing up in England, we had 4 television stations. So every Thursday night, if you were 11 to 20 years old, at 7 o'clock, you're watching Top of the Pops.
Yeah, same here. We had two stations.
2 stations, right? You watch the same music, you're watching the same stories, you get on the bus or the taxi or whatever. It was a way of bringing us and bridging us. Now, everybody's watching not only their 55,000 channels, but the algorithm of TikTok gives you one thing and gives me something completely different. So that technology is designed to separate, and there are individuals who are making money off our backs for creating that polarization. So what do we do? I think I'd be saying at this point, I'm like, we should create national social service programs so that our kids, from across Spain, boys and girls, age 16, 17, they can volunteer to do environmental work or health work or education work. Things that brings them together as teams, gets them to see each other from across economic, social, cultural divides, but working for the same thing, having fun. You have to humanize the other. And the more we do that, the more we inoculate ourselves against the extremes and the polarization. But it's imagining and planning and putting that in place, right? Changing the way we live. It's like going on you can say I want to go on a diet and become fit, but you can talk about it. At some point I have to stop eating chocolate and I have to start picking up weights. I mean, whatever. But it's really living that alternative future that we want to have, which we probably had 25 years ago without realizing it. So.
And without romanticizing the past either,
yeah.
Right? So, I mean, again, I think what we dislike is quite clear. Why it's happening, I think we can analyze and to a certain extent rationalize. How we change it is a little bit more complex. Maybe what we can share a little bit as well at this point is some success stories, some things we've been part of that, hey, that did make a difference, and who would have thought that, right? So I don't know if we can maybe...
You go first.
I go first.
Yeah.
I've been working in terms of armed conflict with 3 cases mainly. Ferriol mentioned that: Colombia, Philippines, and the Basque Country. And these conflicts have in common that they had been going on for decades. These conflicts have in common that they happen in societies that are more or less at least formally democratic. Elections, it is not authoritarian regimes. These conflicts happen in societies with a quite thriving civil society, all three of them. Which means a lot of things had been tried already. They had been tried at the institutional level, they had been tried from civil society initiatives, which is what both you and me have been working a lot. So the question was always, so what else can we do? What else needs to be done? How do we approach this from a different way? One of the most enriching experience I've had in my life was to say, hey, Colombia and Philippines, they are at the exact opposite side of the world, 12 hours difference, to the point where if you want to travel from one country to the other, you need to decide, do I go east or do I go west? Because it doesn't matter, you can do both, just to situate yourselves. So we did, because they had lots of similarities, but they had no clue about each other, we had an exchange program between, the first year was 10 people from one country and 10 people from the other, from different sectors, security sector, business sector, civil society, journalists, etc. The second and the most rewarding experience was with women from both countries. So we had an indigenous woman from Colombia and from the Philippines, a police officer from the police, and so on. And that was very powerful. It was powerful to learn from each other, but the most powerful part of it was to share the long flight to the other side of the world. Because even they were sitting in a 14-hour plane or waiting for the next plane, and the police officer who had never talked to an indigenous community leader, and the other way around, the human rights activist who would hate the business sector, they would have to start talking about something. So they started talking, do you have children?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I have children. Do you, all of a sudden, in a very polarized society, they were forced to what in their language they ended up saying, what we did is take off our masks. Because when we engage normally, we all carry our mask. Our identity is our public identity. I'm a security officer. I am a human rights activist. I'm a journalist. And yeah, okay, but what's behind it? And this exercise was able to take those masks off. This created relationships. Those relationships eventually led to joint efforts, which eventually led to the police in Colombia having a human rights approach and a women and a gender approach with these same people who participated in this experience. And I think the top side of, and that's sort of a small example of Colombia, but in 2012, all these three contexts, more or less at the same time, went through a paradigm shift. Peace talks began in Colombia. They had been going on secretly, they became public in 2012. Peace negotiations in the Philippines, where I was an observer and advisor to the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, they reached a framework agreement. And 2 years later, they reached a peace agreement. And in the Basque Country, ETA decided to stop their armed struggle. All three in the same year. And it was obviously coincidence, because peace is always, as you know, the sum of multiple efforts, some visible and most invisible. But all three happened at the same year, and I was in all of them, so it was so exciting.
Yeah, but first of all, just as you told the story, I mean, look at how just all of a sudden the energy is positive, right? It's like that's also part of it, that we don't often get to tell the stories that are successful, because the news wants to go in, that they'll focus in on the bomb that went off in the Philippines, not the dialogue that goes around it, right? So we're constantly being fed bad news. And actually, you talked about women. I've worked with women for the last 25 years around the world. Yeah.
UN Security Council resolution,
exactly.
25th anniversary.
This year. This actually just 3 days ago. It's 25 years. Why did I start working with women? Because I was working in England, we were working on this idea of conflict resolution and can you, if you create dialogue and so forth. And what we found was that when you talk to women, first of all, they're the first ones to hear and see the sounds of what's happening in their society. So in Sierra Leone, for example, in the 1990s, the women were saying, we saw the arms being shipped at night on the river and being hidden in our houses. We knew something was happening. We just didn't know who to talk to. Right? So the women know it and feel it. Second, the women are often the first ones to respond and be the first to try and prevent and mitigate the conflict. And putting themselves at risks that we cannot imagine. So I remember talking to some UN peacekeepers about Darfur in Sudan. And this big military guy said, we went to, but there was a tremendous level of rape that was happening there. And he said, we went to the women and we said, why do you keep going out to collect firewood when you know you're going to get raped? Why don't you send the men to do that? And he looked at me, he said, the women just looked at us and said, if our men go, they'll get killed. So the women are making a rational decision to risk being raped to protect their sons and their fathers and their husbands who would get killed. Now, wouldn't you want those women or women like that to be sitting at the tables of negotiation to actually determine what should happen? Right? This is what we're seeing repeatedly around the world, is that when we bring women, similarly from Colombia to the Philippines to Yemen to Afghanistan, frankly, I mean, it's the narrative that we hear from the international community or from their own political leaders is that, women are excluded from these processes because it's our culture. Our culture doesn't allow for women, or you are coming in as an outsider, and this is a Western sort of norm to try and put women in these spaces.
And then, short reminder, peace talks, Northern Ireland, 1990s. Women all excluded until they sort of found a way of getting inside.
Exactly.
But all the talks were all male.
And this is what I always say. I say if it was culture, it would look different in Northern Ireland than it does in Yemen. It's the same thing. And it's not about culture, it's power. Because these guys, and it's often men, who are coming in with their political power or their military power, especially when they have been fighting in a civil war. So they're actually, whichever side of the conflict they're in, they're killing civilians. They're killing their own people, right? They don't want women from civil society coming in and saying, actually, you're wrong and you're wrong. And actually, you don't represent me and you don't represent me. And I represent the kids and the society because I'm the one who's risked my life to save them. So I work with those women. I work with the women who emerge and become the peace builders and are creating that middle ground. And anytime I get depressed about things and I start talking to one of my partners, I'm awed and I'm humbled by what they're doing. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have a partner in Nigeria. We have a fund that it's the only independent fund to support women's peace-building organizations. We raise money and we give money to our partners. And it's not, this year's been 10 years that we've had the fund. So one of our partners is in Nigeria. And when we met her, she was working on the problem of Boko Haram, that was snatching kids and snatching girls and doing horrific things. She said, I need to do a radio program because Boko Haram is saying to people that Islam is against education. But the Islamic leaders in our community say education is for everybody. And we're trying to teach, that we're bringing together principles of peace out of the Quran to show that coexistence and peace and nonviolence is part of Islamic teachings. So we helped her do a radio program. They did a survey before and after 3 months. And it was these, effectively local mullahs speaking on the radio. And they had a 40% increase in school enrollment after that. She then started working in the communities that the husbands were missing, that they'd gone, and she connected them to the official state. Then a couple of years later, she found in a displacement camp, she found a group of women, and it turned out that they were failed suicide bombers. They had been girls who were abducted by Boko Haram, brainwashed, married to their commanders. And in the Boko Haram setting, some of these women had a better life than they did outside in their own societies. They would say things like, I have a refrigerator, I was taught to read the Quran before I was sitting at home and I had no literacy at all. So we also have to think about the inequality and the deprivation that people have. But these women had, these girls, very young, married off. And the rule in the Boko Haram, as well as Daesh and so forth, was that if the first husband dies, they're married off to a second guy. And if the second guy dies, then the women are told, you now have to go and become a suicide bomber. So she found a group of these people. Some of them were still very radical and they wanted to go fight or they wanted to go join their husbands. And she started working with them psychosocially, emotionally, psychologically, economically, teaching them again actually what the rules are of Islam, and brought them out, and now they're living their lives and looking after their kids. And then more and more of them showed up. And then at one point, she was invited to address the military academy in Nigeria, the senior military leadership in Nigeria. And the military has been really part of the problem because they've been so violent in these societies, in these communities. So she took some of these women with her. Now imagine you're sitting with the top brass of the Nigerian military sector. And these women, as our colleague Hamsatu spoke to them, the women who'd been abducted and she'd found in these displacement camps said, by the way, when we were kidnapped, the Boko Haram kidnapped and did all these things to us. But when we were also picked up by the Nigerian military, they raped us too, and all of them. So they had the courage to say this in front of the military leadership. The military leadership first turned to my partner and said, well, what are you going to do about this? And then they realized it's not her problem. They have to deal with it. And since then, they have been working with her and her community, and they've changed, again, the behavior of the military on the ground in the communities. They've allowed her to go into their displacement settings to deal with the children, and she's become an advisor. She's become a human rights advisor to them, and she still continues to work in her community. These are the kinds of stories that I have so many of, and they just show what a difference it makes when you have someone who's of the community, who cares, who's authentic, and who persists in the pursuit of peace and nonviolence. So,
who doesn't necessarily need UN peacekeepers or a big budget,
absolutely, yeah,
or whatever. It might need a few small pocket money to travel to the other community. It might need some institutional support of somebody. I'm not alone, whatever. And so I think we are reaching the final part.
And just on that point, I was at the EU a few years ago, and they said they were doing some support for Nigeria, and they said, oh yeah, we have a $400 million grant, development grant to Nigeria. And I said, well, what about corruption? What about these issues? And they very politely changed the conversation. But as a taxpayer to the EU, these are some of the things that I would like to know. Where does this money go? How do you make sure that that our taxes that go abroad are actually being used effectively? Because the money that I raise and I give, I'm audited 55 times. My Nigerian partner, I give her, if I'm lucky, each year we're able to give her $50,000, $100,000, if we're lucky, right? She is changing the behavior of the army in a way that the millions that we spend from America or the UK or here on security sector reform, which is a big topic, doesn't have impact. So this is where there's just so much potential if we just change the way we think
Which
about
doesn't mean we don't want the EU to spend money in peacemaking. We definitely would want that. And here is the frustrating part. And if you want to we haven't discussed about security and the European security and the security architecture and whatnot. But I was in Brussels last week at the European Union Community of Practice on peace mediation. And it was extremely frustrating to listen to the EU officials who are committed to mediation and dialogue and peacemaking, but admitting that the budget for this work in the last 2 years has reduced by 50%. It went down from more than 50, from 47 million 2 years ago to 21 million this year, and saying, and we still have a hard time with our bosses arguing that this 21 million is very important. And they don't buy it. At the same time, Rearm Europe is planning a budget of 800 billion. So what's happening here?
So
we're completely, it's like peacemaking and dialogue has lost the appeal, the faith in even the European Union, which is a result of war and a peace project, does not believe in, apparently, or not enough in dialogue and peacemaking anymore. And it has this strange approach to security which sees arms and dialogue as a dichotomy. You do either or. Yeah. And hey, you can defend yourself better against Putin if you want, but probably you don't want to reduce the limited money you spend on dialogue and mediation, but also increase it, because it's always so much smaller than the military budget.
But it's also, I think, again, we are being duped by the military-industrial complex. We cannot underestimate that, because if you talk to the military, and I know time is short, we've been doing some work on engaging security actors. And when you talk to the military leadership, they turn around and say, the problems we're facing cannot be dealt with by the army alone. There's biosecurity, climate, terrorism, all sorts of problems. Health. We need a robust civil society. Military hardware is only useful if it remains useless. Think about it. All those tanks and drones and nuclear weapons, if one of them gets used, we're all dead anyway, right? So who is benefiting from that, and who is driving this policy? And what they're doing to us as societies is that they're pitting international development assistance against climate, against money for the elderly and education and housing at home. We shouldn't get into that fight with each other. We should be saying $2.3 trillion or $800 billion, put 1%, put 5% of that as security, as a combination of human security, but also humanizing security. This is where we need to go. Otherwise, the future that we're looking at isn't going to be 800 billion. It's going to be, 1 trillion in the next 10 years, because that becomes the machinery that feeds itself. So it's a moment of serious inflection for all of us. But let's not get into a fight amongst ourselves about this.
All right. So I think, looking at Ferriol, he's sort of suggesting 20 minutes left, and this is probably time if people from the audience have any questions or comments for us. So, Ferriol, over to you.
Well, many comments, in fact. I'll do my best. Bé, hi ha moltes preguntes, intentarem agrupar-les també temàticament. Així que som-hi. La primera té a veure amb la nova realitat tecnològica. Ens diuen han canviat les eines tecnològiques i, per tant, la forma de fer la guerra ja també utilitza noves tecnologies. Com podem lluitar contra això? O com podem, si no lluitar, aprofitar també aquestes noves tecnologies? I quin és el paper de les empreses tecnològiques i quin haurien de prendre i com aconseguir que juguin a favor de la pau i no com un element més de problemes. Si us sembla, faig dos blocs. Aquesta seria una primera, una segona part. Té a veure més amb la vostra feina, amb el paper en la mediació de conflictes. Diu, no és inevitable la parcialitat a l'hora de fer aquesta feina? No és inevitable que hi hagi biaixos polítics i ideològics a darrere quan estàs fent aquesta feina? I una mica enllaçada amb això ens diuen hi havia un conjunt d'acords bàsics de com funcionava el món i de com dirimíem els conflictes. Hi havia una ONU forta i això està canviant. Com hauríem de poder refer aquest món multipolar amb unes noves Nacions Unides i quin és el paper de persones com vosaltres a l'hora de reconfigurar aquest sistema? Fem aquestes primeres i després n'hi ha més.
Per tant, respostes breus.
Tenim 20 minuts. No, tenim 20 minuts, vull dir, dona per...
Sí, each question...
Okay, well,
Ara funciona el micro o torno a aquest? El tècnic?
Jo agafaria el...
Sí, agafo aquest. Ah, sí, millor. Should I
Yeah, go ahead.
start?
Yeah.
Okay.
One question at a time?
Maybe one question at a time?
Yeah.
All right. So on technologies, I must admit, for me it's overwhelming. I'm not a technology freak, and I'm very new to artificial intelligence. I stopped using Twitter. I didn't delete because I still watch what people say, because I have curiosity to see what those I don't like say, but I don't engage in it anymore actively. And still, something that surprised me today, reading the newspaper, was that the recent election in New York, Mamdani won the elections thanks to social media. And I thought we had lost social media, because that was already in the power of those who are interested in us fighting each other and dividing us. And I don't know what social media he used and how right the article was, but he says this guy was unknown a year ago, and if he's known now, it's partially or thanks to his ability and his wife's ability, and of course his team's ability, to use technology to challenge status quo and suggest something different. So I thought, wow, that's interesting. This is a very new domain, and again, a small announcement. We are holding an international peace conference in Santa Coloma, Gramenet, 2 weeks from now. It's called Build Peace Conference, and one of the issues we look at is how to respond to these questions. How can we use technology for peace building?
I would. Do I need to use that? No, okay. So I would say, I would add a couple of thoughts. One, Mamdani used social media, but he had 100,000 volunteers in New York. So it was door-to-door, people knocking on doors and talking to each other. So that combination, again, of the human contact and humanizing and understanding each other together with social media. If you leave it to social media alone, I don't think you get that at all. So I think it brings it back to the human connection and the message of hope and positivity that he had, and then the use of technology. The second thing I would say is, right now the technology companies are moving into the space of military weaponization because there's money there, right? Google was not in that space, and now they are. And this again is a sort of self-fulfilling cycle that we see with our governments. Our governments are putting money in that space, so they're running towards it. What I would love to do is actually say, let's do a summit with the technology companies, a high-level political summit so that we have the Facebooks and the Twitters and get them to come and sit and put some guardrails and parameters. It's like a dialogue. It goes back to the dialogue and mediation question of what kind of societies are you fostering, and what can we as governments do to put some guardrails around that, around the use of AI, which is also problematic right now. And then the third thing is that again, resources, the amount of money that our sector has to engage in social media in a professional way is 0.0001. I mean, it's minuscule. We're not good at. It's not that we're not good at it. It's we do not have the resources to be effective in the cultural media spaces, whether it's storytelling, whether it's documentary making, etc. That kind of engagement with the public. And we need it because I think that, and I'd be curious what the audience says, but I think that if we had more stories of how the human endeavor of making a peace agreement, the human endeavor and the heroism that comes with doing the kind of work that we've seen, that would also inspire people to think differently about what is possible. But it's absent in our newspapers, it's absent in our storytelling, it's absent in our social media. And in fact, the opposite is true. So if you think about Afghanistan, for 20 years we were told it was all a failure. It was all corruption and violence and nothing worked in Afghanistan. It wasn't true. There were Afghan women who were lawyers and judges and policewomen and girls and boys going to university and incredibly rich life that was building from the ground up by Afghans. but it was never, those stories were never told. And then when it came to negotiations, we completely excluded that sector of society. We just handed it to the Taliban. So our media, I think, is really responsible for some of this. But we need a dialogue with them because they're also, the future is also them.
Okay, mentioning the word of dialogue leads us to the other question, I think. Dialogue can be a dialogue like you and me without Fariol moderating, or it can have a facilitator. In peace processes, there are both options, but the most frequent one is that there's a third side, more heavily, more lightly, but somehow involved. And then the question comes about neutrality. Is that person neutral? Neutrality does not exist. Nobody is neutral. Everybody has views, perspectives, biases. What if you play the role of facilitating a conversation is that you have to do something that can be difficult, which is suspend judgment. I may dislike you fully, but for the purpose of what we are doing, I will forget about what you just did, that you are a killer and whatever, because I will not look back at what you did. I will look forward to try to prevent you from doing that. I think that's very much Ernest's message as well, right? I mean, I know ETA is killing, but I am curious to try to understand what is needed to prevent them from continue killing, okay? That's extremely tricky because you will be met with suspicion from everybody, especially if it's in your own context. Because if you are in a context, you are labeled, you are from one side. If you go to the other side, they will wonder, why is that person coming here? What's his intention? Is he a spy? Does he have a secret agenda? What not? If you're successful and gain the trust from the other side, you go back to your own community and your own community gets suspicious. Wow, he just was there and had a dialogue and nothing happened to him. Has he become a traitor? Is he now with the others? So you have to win back the faith and the support from your own community. And it's very tricky to live in that space. But however, there are people willing to take that risk in all societies, like the woman you mentioned of Boko Haram in Nigeria. There are natural bridge builders, and there are professional bridge builders. And you need a little bit of both. I don't know.
Yeah. I would add that when you're coming from the outside, or even from the inside, actually, but especially if you're coming from the outside, what is, for me, what is my kind of moral compass? And my moral compass is that I am there precisely to try and help stop other people getting hurt, so stopping the future violence, representing the people that are being hurt. Like my job is not to say, oh, Taliban, you're great. My job is to say, Taliban, we have to talk to you because you're causing violence. But I will, I'm coming from the United Nations, or I'm coming from the EU, or I'm coming on behalf of the United States, and the policies of my institution and the identity that I bring says that I will talk to you, not only I will talk to you about girls' education and the rights of minorities, but I am mandated to talk to the women and the minorities. I am mandated to bring their voice in and create a space where they can engage as well. That's where our resolutions and our laws and policies come in. I'm not a sole agent. If I come in under the rubric of the United Nations, I have to bring the United Nations values and principles and policies in, and that's one of the things that our mediators don't do, and they're not held accountable. The number of people I know who go from mediating in Afghanistan to Syria to wherever, and they don't actually uphold the principles and laws of their own institution, is part of the failure. If you were a lawyer, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. If you were a doctor, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. There are certain core principles and practices and things you don't do. And yet in our field of practice, as we've tried to improve the context and the framing, we're getting individuals that take a menu approach to it. So it's not about necessarily being neutral or impartial. It's also about saying, my job is this. My job is this, right? That I have to, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure that I'm hearing those voices and bringing those voices. Why are we rewarding violence constantly? Why do we just, if that's the logic, then Afghan women should become terrorists, and then we'll see them in Doha in 5 years' time, right? That's not the logic of what we should be doing. We should be rewarding those who are being peaceful.
Talking about UN principles, EU principles, and so on, I think leads us to the third question, and Periol asked us to be shorter. But at this time where the annual UN General Assembly took place, and Trump essentially said the UN is useless, and he is breaking all the international rules of behavior, people do ask, I do get the question often, so what's the purpose of the UN? They are unable to prevent wars, and now even the big powers are challenging their usefulness. A quick answer to that usually is, if it didn't exist, it would need to be invented, and if it's not working well enough, it needs to be reorganized. Now, this is not big news. Many people for many years have many times suggested many ways in which the UN could be reformed. You have worked a lot for the UN, so you have an inside experience, can bring that. My suggestion for the European context, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which bridges former East and Western blocs at the end of the Cold War, was created to prevent what Putin just did. Obviously, if Putin invades Ukraine, there's a failure. There's a systemic failure of the system. Something we now need to think of what will need to be different after this war is over, so we prevent a new one from happening. I don't see enough people and organizations and institutions thinking about this, thinking now, we need now weapons to defend ourselves. Okay, but someday the war will end, and in 10 years from now or 20, what instruments will we have there? And it has to be some sort of multilateral system. And if the one we have now does not work well enough, and it had failures, we need to think and work hard to create something that's better.
Yeah, I would add that, I would add two things. One is...
Sanam.
Yeah, very quick. Sorry, very, very quick. Number one, we need to interrogate why Putin was able to go into Ukraine. It's a failure of diplomacy and politics from the West side. It was taking the eye off the ball. And we need to understand that, because our diplomats were warning. And so the question of, did we have radical 24/7 intense diplomatic measures to try and put some guardrails around it and prevent this? This is really important. Similarly with Afghanistan, I think we don't interrogate where the failures were, and we need to learn from those. Second is, in terms of multilateralism, I see it as an ecosystem model. And I go back to the Charter of the United Nations, which starts with we, the peoples of the United Nations. Not we, the member states, we, the peoples. And the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then all the 30 years, 25 years of work that we've done to say, there are peace builders, women peace builders, youth peace builders, civil society. These conflicts and these contexts that we're dealing with, governments alone cannot deal with them. They need a robust civil society. We need to be working hand in hand together. And we're here. We're all saying, hello, UN, work with us. We've got solutions for you. Hello, governments, work with us. And what are they doing? They are not engaging the community of practice. They are doing it in a checkbox way. So that also needs to change. But I think that if we actually rethought it and thought about it as an ecosystem, you need governments, you need civil society, you need the community organizations working towards peace and nonviolence and pluralism and equality. It's all there. It's just joining up the dots. So we can do it.
Dos blocs més de preguntes per acabar, però algunes les heu anat responent, però perquè consti. Una sobre les dificultats del diàleg i d'establir els processos de pau. Diuen, una més o menys s'ha contestat, però les enumero. Diu, per què s'hauria de dialogar amb persones l'objectiu del qual és la nostra destrucció? Diu, per què s'hauria de dialogar amb persones l'objectiu dels quals és la nostra destrucció? Un altre, en aquesta direcció, ens diu, com podem respondre amb mitjans pacífics si el nostre país està sent envaït per grups armats que són enemics del nostre país? Un altre ens diu, parlem de diàleg, però com es pot aplicar el diàleg quan s'ha perdut el respecte a l'ésser humà, a la confiança en les institucions? Què podem fer? Com podem parlar quan ningú ens escolta? I una tercera més en aquesta direcció. Ens diuen, en un procés d'evolució d'una dictadura a un règim democràtic, quins elements cal tenir en compte per evitar situacions com les de països com, per exemple, pot haver estat Espanya, que diuen que a partir de l'amnistia de l'any 77, doncs poden seguir, la gent pot seguir controlant institucions de poder. És a dir, preguntes que tenen a veure amb les dificultats del diàleg, etc. I com que estem tancant, no vull deixar de fer un últim bloc per acabar amb una mica més d'optimisme. Un primer, ens demanen sobre els joves, no? Què poden fer els joves per millorar la situació d'aquest declivi de la democràcia? I un altre sobre els joves ens diu el que s'està dient dels joves de que no tenen, de que veuen un futur pitjor, etc. No és una trampa en si mateix dir-los tota l'estona que tenen un futur pitjor i que viuran pitjor que les seves famílies i que, per tant, no poden sobreposar-se a aquesta realitat que els hi ve i això els fa reaccionar com estan reaccionant. I per acabar, i justament partint d'aquesta, una última pregunta que podria ser per acabar de tancar, ens diuen una cosa tan simple com podríem plantar llavors de pau en tots nosaltres. Com podríem plantar llavors de pau en cadascú de nosaltres. Si us sembla, acabarem així.
Mirarem de fer-ho ràpid i, efectivament, algunes coses més telegràficament i algunes idees. I don't know if you agree, but when you asked about life experiences that had a positive impact, my experience is that we do witness more often than we realize deep changes, positive changes. And I would put the examples again of ETA here, or FARC in Colombia, or the armed conflict in Mindanao in the Philippines. Just a few years back, would we imagine that ETA would ever be gone? They had been around for 60 years. And the day they announce we stop violence, we celebrate, but then we already want more. And for good reasons. When are you handing up the weapons? When will you ask for apology? When will you? And that's all good. But hey, they decided to stop existing. That was unthinkable just very recently ago. And so I think one thing is to be aware that we do achieve significant change very often, but when we do achieve it, we maybe don't appreciate it enough. And I think, again, I insist, for good reasons. But that means that somebody spoke to killers. Somebody spoke to those who want to kill us or to destroy us. Somebody did, somehow. And it may not be it may be somebody from inside, their own people, who started thinking differently, whatever. But somebody did to change somebody else's mind. And that happens all the time, and that needs to be triggered, and it could be done so in multiple ways. And I take out 3 questions because, for the sake of time. Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, good. Yeah.
I don't have a quick answer for the other 2. So
okay.
Give me some.
Yeah. I would add a couple of things. One is that any war and violence and anger are aberrations. They're not our human norm. Hobbes, I think, was actually wrong. It's not, human nature has an element of violence, but 99% of us, and especially the female percentage, on average, prefers to try and deal with things either through coexistence or putting up with it or through words. We can be very nasty with our words, etc. But violence itself is not our standard norm. And so whether it's the 100-year wars that was in Europe, however many centuries ago, or the genocide in Gaza, at some point it has to stop. And one of the things we don't take into account is that if you take the state of Israel and they're perpetrating genocide, and let's say they erase everybody, all the Palestinians, what do they become? So in destroying the other, you're destroying yourself as well. And this is something that we have to also acknowledge, that violence, the cycle of violence that goes on and on and on, is destructive for everybody. And somebody at some generation, at some point, Somebody has to stop and say, enough, we have to do it differently. Colombia, that's what they did. Philippines, that's what they did. The Kurds, that's what they've done. And even when we've had wars that one side has won, Sri Lanka, the government massacred 300,000 people. It still wasn't the end. You still need a political solution because the problem is one of inequality and injustice, right? So our work is trying to shorten the time of violence and create the space for dialogue. You need political will and you need inclusivity. You need your public demand to push the political will, or if you have the political will, you need the public behind you because you've demonized the other side so much that the public may not be with you as you make. So those conditions are important. Second thing, on the question of justice, people want justice. People want recognition. We're not going to be able to throw everybody in jail. We're not going to be able to prosecute everyone. But you want an acknowledgement of the hurt and the harm. You need memorialization. We need days where we recognize this. So I think, again, we look at South Africa. They had a court for some of the egregious crimes that happened, but they also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We don't need to reconcile. Even reconciliation and forgiveness are very personal. But at least let the truth come out. Let the story be there so that we know and there is an acknowledgement of the people who lost their lives and the trauma. If we don't have the justice, I think things go below the surface and they come up at some point. And as I say, as we talked about the young people before, I'll just end with that. So that pessimism will only take us, if we imagine pessimistically, it's only going to take us to the worst place. So it really is about taking a stand and saying, what's the world that you want? And celebrating what you already have. When I look at young people right now, they barely seek, gender, race, ethnicity, all these things that in our time might have been a problem. For young people, they're predominantly not. And it's important to celebrate that. If young men are feeling disillusioned right now, I would like to say to them, our agenda is not about saying women are now better and men have to go and suffer. It's about transformative equality, because if we have war, the first people to go and get killed are our young boys. What we're trying to fight for is so that neither our men nor our women, neither our sons nor our daughters have to ever experience the hell of war. So we need to see that these agendas of equality and rights and so forth, they're trying to change the power dynamics, but it's power dynamics that ultimately are better for everybody. So that's what I would say.
That's the positive note on which you end. And I'll try to add to that I think what youth are telling us in this survey, for instance, is alarm signals. Hey, something's wrong. So it is a call for action. And it is, I think we need, the youth has a capacity. They may have an opinion now, doesn't mean they will stick to that opinion. But it does mean if I feel I am hopeless, it is because there might be structural violence, as I said before. There's difficulty to access housing. So that is something that needs to be addressed. If young people in general, but young people specifically, feel that confrontation is the normal, then we probably need to change something, whether it's in our political way of running governments and politics, or in the digital space. At the end of the day, everybody, as you said before, who's ready to kill and die for something? If you ask that question, very few people will
or kill
or die for whatever cause. So hey, let's help combat pessimism, because there's interest in fueling that and the confrontation, and we are in a cultural combat. In an asymmetric combat against those who are interested in fueling division and hatred. But it's against human nature, as you said. Human nature is not about hating the other or confronting the other. We live in conflict all the time, but violence is a choice. And if put with the choice, huge majority of people, and especially young people, would not choose violence.
Doncs moltes gràcies, Kristian i Sanam. Em sembla que era molt important, sense ser naïfs, començar aquest cicle parlant de construcció de pau. us recordo que el proper dia, el segon dia, parlarem de llibertat feble i forces de control, com conviure amb el prestigi del mal, que té a veure amb això que comentàvem ara. Tindrem a l'Ingrid Guardiola, que ha sigut directora del Bòlit del Centre d'Art Contemporani, molt interessant, i la professora de Filosofia, Ana Carrasco Conde, de la Complutense de Madrid, que ens diran coses molt interessants. Volia agrair totes les preguntes que heu fet, que ens hagueu acompanyat avui, i sobretot volia agrair al Kristian i a la Sanam per l'esforç d'haver vingut, per la generositat d'haver compartit les seves reflexions, i per tant, ara que ho hem pogut fer, em sembla que sí que podem marxar a casa contents i una mica més esperançats, per què no, i no caure en aquest pessimista que ens demanàvem. Moltes, moltes, moltes gràcies.